Vincent Carter set the folder on the edge of the administrator's desk and slid it forward with 2 fingers, the way a person returns something that was never really theirs to begin with. No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then the woman across the desk said she was sorry, and Vincent nodded once and told her he understood, and he meant both things without performing either of them. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, thanked the 2 people sitting across from him by name, and walked out into the hallway. The hospital was loud in the way hospitals are always loud at 10 in the morning. Carts and codes and the low-frequency hum of a building that never fully stops. Vincent moved through it the way he had moved through it for 11 years, steady and unhurried, the way a man moves when he knows the exact location of every door. He reached the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby. He waited. The doors opened. He stepped in. A nurse he recognized from the pediatric wing gave him a small nod and looked back at her phone. He looked straight ahead at his own reflection in the brushed steel panel and kept his expression even. The elevator descended. The lobby appeared. He walked through it, pushed through the glass doors, and stepped out into the late October air, which was cold and direct and asked nothing of him. He made it to the far end of the parking lot before he stopped walking. He stood there for a moment between 2 cars with his jacket folded over one arm and let himself feel the specific weight of what had just happened. Not grief, not anger, something more precise than either of those. The sensation of having prepared correctly for something that was not going to happen anyway. Vincent Carter had been a respiratory therapist at Mercy General Hospital for 11 years. Before that, 7 years at a county facility in Akron, 3 years before that in a rehab center outside Columbus. He had worked in the field for 21 years total and held 2 advanced certifications and a clinical teaching credential he'd earned on his own time and his own money during the years when time and money were both in very short supply. His wife, Denise, had been gone for 14 months, a diagnosis in the spring and then a very fast progression, and then a Tuesday in August that had redefined what the word ordinary was capable of containing. She had been 44 years old. Their son, Marcus, had been 11. Marcus was 12 now, and the difference between those 2 ages had cost both of them something that didn't have a clean name. Marcus had type 1 diabetes. He had been managing it since he was 7, which meant Vincent had been managing it alongside him since he was 7. The continuous glucose monitors, the insulin pump supplies, the quarterly endocrinology visits, the school nurse coordination, the middle-of-the-night alerts that required a calm response even when calm was not what the moment felt like. Denise had carried half of all of it. Now the entire weight sat on one side of the scale, and that side was Vincent. The insurance through Mercy General was the thing that held everything else upright. Without it, the cost of Marcus's supplies alone would have consumed more than 1/3 of Vincent's monthly income, and that was before the co-pays, before the specialist visits, before the pharmacy runs that had to happen on schedule regardless of what else the week required. The insurance was not a benefit. It was a structural element. Remove it and the whole arrangement came apart. The director of respiratory services position had opened up in June. Vincent had not applied immediately, not because he doubted his qualifications, but because he understood the weight of what he was considering. Moving into administration meant leaving the bedside work he had built his professional identity around. It meant a different kind of responsibility, a broader scope, a harder distance from the patients he'd spent 2 decades knowing how to read. He had thought about it for 3 weeks before submitting the application. He had told exactly one person that he'd applied, his sister, Renata, who had called on a Sunday afternoon to check in on Marcus and on him, in that order, and who had listened without interrupting while he explained the situation. She had said, "You're the most qualified person in that building for that job." Vincent had not said anything in response, because saying thank you would have felt like agreeing with something he wasn't ready to agree with, and she would have understood that too. The interview process had run 6 weeks, 4 rounds, panel discussions, a formal presentation, a case study review that had required him to analyze a staffing model and present improvement recommendations to a committee of 3 administrators. He had done all of it. He had been thorough and prepared and specific in the way that came naturally to someone who had spent 21 years doing a job where specificity was not optional. The 4th interview had been this morning, and it had not gone the way he had hoped, though it had gone in a direction he had seen, coming from somewhere around the 15-minute mark. The committee chair was a man named Bradford Yule, a hospital administrator who had arrived from outside the system 8 months ago, and who conducted interviews the way someone conducts a review of a contract they expect to find errors in. He had looked at Vincent's application with the careful neutrality of a man who had already reached a conclusion and was working backward to justify it. When he got to Vincent's current title, respiratory therapist, clinical level 3, he had set the folder down with a particular kind of deliberateness. He had said that the position required demonstrated administrative leadership experience. He had said that Vincent's clinical record was exceptional, and he meant it, or something in the vicinity of it. He had said that the committee was looking for candidates with a minimum of 3 years in a supervisory or managerial capacity, ideally with budget oversight. Vincent had explained his team lead work during the department's equipment transition 2 years prior. He had described the 6 months he had spent coordinating across 4 units during the respiratory staff shortage, effectively performing the function of a department supervisor without the title or the compensation. He had said it plainly, without bitterness, because bitterness was not the point, and he was not there to make a point. He was there to make a case. Bradford Yule had nodded in the way that people nod when they have stopped listening, but want to appear as though they haven't. Then he had said something about organizational fit and the committee's overall direction, and Vincent had understood, with the precision that comes from 2 decades of reading rooms, that the conversation was finished. Not the meeting. The conversation. The decision had been made somewhere before he arrived, and this room had only ever been a formality. He could have said more. He had the arguments prepared and the evidence to support them, and the professional composure to deliver both without any edge that would have made the committee uncomfortable. But continuing would have required him to perform for an audience that was no longer present, and he had never been able to make himself do that. Not in 21 years of work, not in 14 months of grief, not now. He thanked Bradford Yule and both committee members by name. He said he appreciated the thorough process and that he had found the experience valuable. Then he gathered the folder he had brought and stood and pushed the chair back with his foot and walked to the door. One of the committee members, a woman named Patricia Holloway, had started to say something as he reached the handle. A single soft syllable, the beginning of something that didn't become a word before the door had already closed behind him. He had taken the elevator to the ground floor and crossed the lobby and walked out to the parking lot and stopped between 2 cars and stood with the cold air around him and the weight of the morning sitting precisely where it sat. He was not done. He understood that clearly. He was 42 years old and capable of adjusting his direction, and the situation was not the end of anything, only the end of this particular path on this particular morning. He had learned how to think in those terms. Denise had been better at it than he was, and after she was gone, he had worked to absorb the habit from memory, because the alternative was getting lost in the gap between what was and what was supposed to be, and Marcus needed someone who could navigate by what was. He put his jacket on, found his keys, and walked to his car. He had been inside the hospital for 18 minutes. Vincent Carter had started at Mercy General in the year Marcus was born. He knew the building the way a person knows a place they have spent more waking hours in than their own home. Every unit, every corridor, every elevator bank, every supply closet and break room, and the specific quality of light in the overnight wing at 4 in the morning. He had intubated patients in this building, managed ventilators through 3-day crises, sat with families in waiting rooms and explained, with as much care as the situation would hold, what the numbers meant and what the next hours were likely to look like. He had been present at a great many endings. He had gotten very good at staying calm inside them. It was a Wednesday night in early September when the position changed everything, or when the possibility of it did. He had been returning equipment to the 4th floor storage corridor around 9:45 in the evening, a small logistical task at the end of a long shift, when he passed the administrative bulletin board near the elevator and stopped. He almost kept going. The bulletin board was not something he stopped at as a rule, but a phrase caught him in the periphery the way certain things do, 2 words that registered before the rest did. Benefits package. He stepped back. He read the full posting. Director of Respiratory Services, full administrative role, benefits at the executive tier, salary range listed at the bottom. The position had been open for internal applicants for 4 days. The window closed in 10. He read it twice. He memorized the posting number. He did not take a photo of it, because something about photographing it felt like a commitment he wasn't ready to name. He walked back to the elevator and rode it down to the 3rd floor and finished the last 20 minutes of his shift and clocked out and drove home. In the car, he did not let himself think about it directly. Thinking about it directly was the fastest route to a version of hope that had a long way to fall. He got home at 11:15. He let himself in quietly, though Marcus slept like a person who had decided sleeping was non-negotiable and had since he was small. Vincent checked the glucose monitor reading on his phone from the hallway. Steady. Good range. He stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, and then he saw it. A piece of paper on the counter, folded in half, his name written on the outside in the uneven handwriting Marcus used when he was in a hurry or feeling something too big to write carefully. Vincent stood in the kitchen and looked at the note for a moment before picking it up. He opened it and read it once. He read it again more slowly. It was short. Marcus was not a child who wrote long things, and he had not written this to be dramatic. He had written it because something had needed to be said, and 12-year-olds did not always know when to wait. It said the thing. The exact thing Vincent had been carefully not saying to himself since August of the previous year. Seeing it in his son's handwriting, in the particular forward slant Marcus used when he was trying to be neat, reading it standing in his kitchen at 11:15 at night in his work clothes, made it impossible to fold back up and set aside. He sat at the table for a long time with the note in front of him. He submitted the application before midnight. He did not tell Marcus he had done it. He did not tell his sister. He closed the laptop and made himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, which was very dark and very ordinary, and tried to feel like a man who had done a simple, reasonable thing. He was not entirely successful at that, but the application was in, and that part he could hold on to. The 6 weeks that followed were the particular kind of difficult that doesn't make itself obvious. He went to work each day and did his job with the same attention he had always brought to it. He studied administrative leadership frameworks at 10 o'clock at night after Marcus was in bed. He thought about what he would say when they asked about his supervisory experience, because they would ask about it. And the answer needed to be honest and complete without sounding like he was compensating for a gap he already knew was there. He thought about what to wear to the 4th round interview, which turned out to be a smaller question than he expected, because he had dressed for professional settings regularly enough that the clothes were not the hard part. The hard part was the 4th round interview itself, which he had prepared for with the same method he used for everything that mattered, by learning as much as possible in advance, by anticipating the hard questions, by being ready to answer the thing they were actually asking, rather than the thing they said they were asking. He had been ready. He had believed, or had come close to believing, that readiness was going to be enough. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 9 minutes. Then he started the engine and drove to pick up Marcus from school. The school pickup line moved at its usual pace. Marcus got in the back seat and said, "How'd it go?" without looking up from his phone, which was the way he asked most questions these days, a habit that Vincent chose not to fight because the questions themselves were the part that mattered. Vincent said, "It went." Marcus looked up then. He had his mother's way of reading a room through a single person's expression. He had been doing it since he was 4. "They went with someone else?" Marcus said. "Seems like it's heading that direction." Marcus looked back at his phone for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That was the wrong call." Vincent pulled out of the lot and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to add to that sentence, and Marcus had said it the way it needed to be said. They drove for 3 blocks before his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer on the 4th ring. He pulled to the side of the road and put the car in park. "Mr. Carter." The voice was a woman's, direct and unhurried, not the voice of someone's assistant. "This is Nadine Strickland. I'm the Chief of Patient Experience here at Mercy General. I'd like a few minutes of your time if you're available." Vincent told Marcus quietly to hold on. Marcus looked up again, fully this time. Nadine Strickland had been at Mercy General for 6 years. Her position sat adjacent to the clinical hierarchy rather than inside it, overseeing patient satisfaction, care quality audits, and the interface between the hospital's administrative culture and its day-to-day patient-facing work. She was on the Senior Leadership Council. She reported directly to the CEO. Vincent had seen her in the building dozens of times. He had never spoken to her directly. She asked if he was available to come back to the hospital, not the administrative wing, her office, which was on the 2nd floor near the patient advocacy suite. He said he was available. He told Marcus he needed to go back for a bit, and Marcus said okay the way he said most things, with a composure that didn't mean he didn't have feelings about it. They drove back. Vincent dropped Marcus at the family waiting area on the ground floor with a granola bar from the glove compartment and told him he'd be 30 minutes at most. Nadine Strickland's office was smaller than he expected for someone of her position. 2 chairs across a desk, a board on the side wall with 3 columns of index cards, a window that faced the interior stoatrium. She was in her early 50s with the particular kind of composure that comes not from suppressing things, but from having decided which things are worth the energy. She looked at him when he sat down the way someone looks at a document they want to read carefully. "I was at Mercy General 9 months ago," she said, on a Sunday. "I was dealing with a family situation with one of our long-term patients, Theodore Holt, a 91-year-old man in palliative care, whose family had been managing a complicated visitation situation for several weeks." She said it with the neutrality of someone reporting a sequence of events they had already processed. "It was late, around 8 in the evening. I came out of his room and into the hallway, and I found you sitting on the floor outside the room with his daughter, Vivienne, who was in some distress. She had been there alone for most of the afternoon, and I think the evening had been harder than expected. You weren't on duty on that unit. You'd apparently stopped in the hallway and sat down with her." Vincent remembered it. He had been passing through on his way to return a cart to the supply closet on the 7th floor. A woman in her mid-60s sitting in a chair in the corridor outside a room, crying in the quiet way people cry when they don't want to be heard. He had stopped. He was not sure why he had stopped exactly, except that she had looked like someone who had been alone for too long and needed someone to stay still for a moment. He had sat with her for about 40 minutes. He had listened more than spoken. He had explained, when she asked, what palliative oxygen support typically looked like at the stage her father was in. He had answered her questions clearly and without the particular kind of gentleness that can tip into condescension. When a nurse from the unit came by, he had made sure the nurse knew the woman had been there alone and that someone should check in on her through the evening. Then he had gotten up, gotten his cart, and gone back to work. "She mentioned it to me the next morning," Nadine said. "She knew your first name and described your department badge. She said you sat with her for almost an hour, and that you explained her father's condition in a way that no one had taken the time to do in clear terms before. She said she finally understood what was actually happening." She paused. "I looked you up after that," Vincent said. "How is he doing?" He meant Theodore. Nadine said. "He passed in November. Peacefully, I'm told." Vincent nodded. "Good," he said, and he meant it the way the word was actually meant. Nadine looked at him steadily. "What happened in the director's interview this morning, I'm familiar with how Bradford Yule runs those processes. I'm not here to litigate it or to apologize for an outcome that was, in some ways, predictable given his criteria." She said it without softening the edges more than the truth required. "I'm here because the work I do depends on understanding people, and what I saw in that hallway last November told me something about you that a CV and a panel interview are not especially good at capturing." Vincent sat across from her and thought about Marcus waiting on the ground floor and the note on the kitchen counter and the 42 years of his life that had produced exactly this moment in exactly this configuration. He thought about the 11 years he had spent in this building and the 21 before that, and what it meant to be seen by someone who had the authority to make that recognition mean something concrete. "What are you offering?" he said. She told him. Not the director of respiratory services position, which had run its process and would be filled on its own track. What she was describing was a newly structured role, a patient care integration specialist, that sat within her office and would require him to work across clinical units, administrative planning, and care quality. It was a bridge position, one that didn't have a clean precedent in the hospital's organizational chart, which she acknowledged directly. It came with full benefits at the administrative tier, a salary step above his current clinical grade, and a 90-day review period at the end of which the role would be evaluated for permanent placement. She said it would require him to operate in territory he hadn't held formally before. It would require him to demonstrate something to a building full of people who had categorized him for 11 years as a clinician and had not yet updated that categorization. It was not a comfortable offer, it was a real one. Vincent sat with the sound of the hospital moving around them, the subtle background frequency of the place where he had spent more of his adult life than anywhere else, and he thought about what it meant to say yes to something that didn't have clear edges. He had spent the last 14 months becoming good at being careful. Careful with money, careful with time, careful with hope, because hope that fell too far was a cost he couldn't absorb on top of everything else. He thought about Marcus downstairs with his granola bar and his phone, and his mother's ability to read a room through a single person's face. He thought about the glucose monitor on his phone that he checked at 11:15 every night. He thought about the endocrinologist appointment in December that they had already postponed once. He thought about the note on the kitchen counter and the particular slant of the handwriting, and what it had taken for a 12-year-old to write it and leave it without saying anything about it in person. He thought about what it meant to make a decision when certainty wasn't available. He had not had certainty available for 14 months. He had learned to make decisions anyway by a simpler measure. Which choice on a bad day at the end of a hard week could he still live with? The answer was always the same one. Forward, even when forward was harder. 90 days, he said. I'll take it. Nadine gave a small nod, the kind that meant the terms were set and they could move on to the practical matters. There's paperwork, she said. HR can meet with you tomorrow morning if that works. Vincent said it worked. He stood, thanked her by name, and walked back out through the second-floor corridor toward the elevator. He pressed the button for the ground floor. He rode down in a car with a phlebotomist he recognized from the morning rounds, who nodded at him and looked at her watch, and he looked at the steel panel and kept his expression level. Marcus was where he had left him, sitting in the third chair from the left in the family waiting area, with his phone in his lap and his backpack on the floor, and his eyes on the door when Vincent came through it. He had been watching the door. He was 12 years old, and he had been watching the door the way people watch for something they are not sure they should hope for. Vincent sat down next to him. Well, Marcus said. Different position, Vincent said. Patient care integration. Reports to the chief of patient experience. Marcus turned that over for a moment. Is it better? Vincent thought about it honestly. It's real, he said. Marcus looked at the floor for a second, then looked back up. Okay, he said. It was the word he used when he was done with words and meant what he said. They walked out through the lobby and into the parking lot in the late afternoon light, and Vincent drove home the same way he drove every day. But the drive felt differently proportioned somehow, like a route he had taken 100 times that had shifted very slightly in its dimensions and would require some recalibration before he fully understood the new distances. The paperwork took most of the next morning. An HR coordinator named Beverly Malone walked him through the role documentation in a small conference room on the 4th floor and explained the benefits enrollment window and the reporting structure and the start date. When she got to the health coverage section and showed him the tier that now applied to his household, he looked at the page for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He started the following Monday. The role had no designated workspace, which was deliberate. Nadine Strickland's view, which she had explained in their first operational meeting on his second day, was that integration work happened where the work happened, and a fixed desk produced a fixed perspective. She gave him a hospital-issued laptop and a phone and a list of 8 clinical units he would begin observing over the first 30 days. He was to attend rounds, attend care conferences, attend family meetings where permitted, and produce a written assessment at the end of the month on where the gaps between clinical intent and patient experience were largest. The clinical staff read him with the careful neutrality that people use when they encounter someone whose function they are not sure how to categorize. He was not administration, but he was reporting to administration. He was not clinical, but he had 21 years of clinical floor time, and it showed in the way he moved and the questions he asked and the things he noticed without being told to notice them. He did not explain himself. He let the work explain itself. The first substantive test came at the end of his 3rd week. A family named the Ashworths had been at Mercy General for 11 days with their son, Fletcher, age 8, who had presented with a severe pneumonia that had complicated into a partial lung involvement requiring respiratory support. Fletcher was improving. The clinical picture was moving in the right direction, but the Ashworths, both of them, had reached a point of exhaustion and a specific kind of friction with the nursing staff on the unit that had produced 3 formal complaints in 5 days and a request from the unit manager to escalate. The complaints were not about clinical care. The care was good. The complaints were about communication. Specifically, the family felt that no one explained the same thing the same way twice, that each shift produced a different version of what was happening and what to expect, and that after 11 days they still did not understand the actual timeline or what the discharge threshold was. The unit manager, a veteran named Gerald Foss, brought it to Vincent because Vincent had been sitting in on rounds that week and had heard the exchanges firsthand, and because Gerald had run out of internal options. Vincent spent 90 minutes with the Ashworths the following morning. He did not have a prepared script. He sat across a small table from two people who had been living in a hospital for 11 days, with an 8-year-old who was scared and had been scared for a while, and he listened to everything they said without redirecting them and without taking notes until they had said all of it. Then he explained Fletcher's respiratory situation from the beginning, in plain terms, using the actual measurements and the actual benchmarks and the actual sequence of what recovery from this particular presentation looked like in practice. He did not use language designed to reassure. He used language designed to be accurate, because accuracy was the thing they had not been getting, and the absence of it was what had produced the friction. He explained what the discharge threshold was in concrete terms. He told them what the number needed to be and where it currently was, and what the typical trajectory looked like, with the caveat that typical did not mean guaranteed. He gave them a framework for understanding the updates they would receive from each shift rather than a new set of facts to manage. By the end of the conversation, the Ashworths had no new clinical information. Everything Vincent had told them had already been in the room. He had simply organized it in a way that let two exhausted people hold it without it spilling. No further complaints were filed. Fletcher Ashworth was discharged 4 days later in stable condition, with a follow-up plan his parents had participated in building. Gerald Foss stopped Vincent in the corridor outside the unit the afternoon Fletcher left. He said that was well handled. He said it the way clinical people say things they mean, flat and without elaboration, which is how Vincent would have known it was genuine, even if he hadn't already known Gerald Foss well enough to read him. The word moved through the hospital the way things always move through hospitals, which is to say sideways and without announcement. Not dramatically, not with any specific acknowledgement, but the quality of Vincent's reception on each unit shifted incrementally across the following weeks, from the watchful uncertainty of someone they hadn't decided about yet, to the quieter attention of someone they were paying attention to, for reasons they were starting to understand. He noticed it without making too much of it, one data point at a time. The 90-day review was on a Thursday. Nadine's assistant sent the calendar invite the week prior, and Vincent arrived at the second floor at the scheduled time in the same gray jacket he'd worn to every meeting with her, because consistency was one of the forms of respect he knew how to offer reliably. She was already at her desk when he came in. She gestured to the chair. He sat. She said the position was being made permanent. She said the salary adjustment would move him to the full grade equivalent for the patient care integration role. Then she said that as a direct result of the Ashworth intervention and 2 subsequent situations that had been similarly handled, the hospital's patient satisfaction scores for the inpatient respiratory and pulmonary units had moved measurably in the most recent quarterly audit, which mattered in ways that extended beyond the numbers themselves. She said, "What you did with that family was not a procedure. It wasn't a protocol. It was judgment. Knowing what they actually needed and delivering it in a way they could use. That's not something I can write into a training module." She was not one for longer speeches than the truth required. He was not one for longer responses. He said he appreciated the opportunity she had extended. She said, "You earned the continuation. Those are different things." He walked out of the hospital at 5:15 that afternoon, for the first time in recent memory without a shift ending behind it. He sat in his car for a moment in the parking lot with his hands in his lap, not calculating anything, which was unusual enough to notice. He drove home and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table with Marcus, who told him about a science project involving water filtration and a presentation he was mildly anxious about. And Vincent listened and asked questions, and Marcus answered them with the focused energy of someone who had decided to treat his father as someone worth explaining things to, which was the particular form of love a 12-year-old could offer without knowing that's what it was. After Marcus went to bed, Vincent sat at the table for a while in the quiet. The insurance card had arrived in his second week on the new role. He had opened the envelope standing at the mailbox at the end of the driveway, which was where he had always opened anything official, outside in the air, with room around him. He had held the card for a moment before putting it in his wallet, because it represented something that a piece of laminated plastic had no business being able to represent, and yet very clearly did. He had called the endocrinologist the same afternoon. The December appointment they had postponed was rescheduled, The doctor reviewed Marcus's pump settings and made 2 adjustments, and said the management over the past year had been excellent given the circumstances, and Vincent had thanked her without elaborating on what the circumstances had actually involved. The overnight alerts became less frequent over the next few weeks, not because the diabetes changed, but because the pump calibration was tighter and the monitoring protocol the doctor had suggested was easier to implement with the right supplies, and the right visit cadence and the specific absence of one particular form of background anxiety that had been present for 14 months. That was the change that mattered most. Not the title and not the salary, and not what Bradford Yule had thought he was doing when he closed that folder in the committee room. The note from Marcus was still on the kitchen counter. Vincent had moved it once, briefly, during a cleaning and put it back afterward. He was not sure when he would move it for good. It said what it said, and what it said had gotten him to that bulletin board on the 4th floor, and to the midnight application, and to the parking lot between the 2 cars, and ultimately to the 2nd floor office where a woman with a board of index cards had looked at him and seen something she had decided was worth the risk of a new position. And none of that would have happened if he had walked past a woman crying alone in a hallway one Sunday evening in November. He had not stopped because he expected anything from it. He had stopped because it was the thing to do, because there was a person in distress and he happened to be the one walking by. He had no way of knowing someone was watching. He had not done it to be watched, and that, he had come to understand, was exactly the point. Some things cannot be demonstrated in a committee room. Some things can only be seen in a hallway at 8 in the evening, when a person thinks no one is paying attention and acts from their actual character, because there is no performance to give and no audience to give it to. That was the version of himself he had brought to every moment of the past 21 years. Denise had known it. Marcus, in the particular way of children who do not yet know what they know, had always known it. And now there was one more person who knew it, and she had the authority and the judgment to make that recognition into something that held. He did not need more than that. He sat at the kitchen table until the house had fully settled into the sound of itself at night, the refrigerator and the heat and the small particular quiet of a place that held the 2 of them, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely account for, he was not running numbers in his head. Not the insulin supplies, not the copay schedule, not the gap between the month's expenses and the month's income. He was just sitting. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't the end of the hard parts. It was something smaller and more durable than either of those, a stable place to stand, and the knowledge that he had gotten there by continuing to be, under pressure and observation and grief and uncertainty, exactly who he actually was. That had been enough. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.